Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we are still in for 1 Corinthians, where I'm going to be in 1 Corinthians 8, looking at chapter or verses 1 through 13. And we're going to be looking at food sacrificed to idols. Now, again, this is not something that really applies to us today. Food sacrificed to idols is not something we really worry about much in a Christendom, but there's some examples I'll use that we can use this for, and we'll look at that as we go through this. But as always, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, ask that you do that. That way we can, keep up with you, and you can not keep up with you, but you can keep up with us, and that way you can, we publish these daily, and so that way you can get the alerts, get the notifications of how we're when we publish these, and continue with this study with us. And so we would love for you to join us in that. And as always, I really appreciate all those who have been following along with this study and looking at these things as we go into the Bible daily. But as always, appreciate all those. So getting into this, 1 Corinthians 8, verses 1 through 13 says, "Now regarding your question about food that has been offered to idols, yes, we know that we all have knowledge about the issue, but while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church." This is I'm going to stop here. This is very important. There's so many. I remember a lot of times growing up in the church, the bragging quote would be about how much we knew our Bible, especially those in this particular denomination, how much they knew their Bible, right? And that was good. I mean, it's good to know your Bible, but a lot of times that didn't show through. There wasn't a lot of love sometimes behind that. It was, there could be some very harsh, very critical people behind that. Well, we know our Bible and all this, and it's like, well, he's saying here, like, while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church. That's the most important thing. Knowledge is important. Love is the most important thing. And if you can have all the knowledge in the world, if you don't show any love, then your faith, everything's worthless. And we're going to look at that when we get to chapter 13. And so he says, anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know very much. And so and this is another thing, if you're part of a group who's like, hey, we have all the answers, unless unless you follow things exactly like we do, you're not going to heaven, or or there's just, the idea is, hey, you have to be part of us, or we're the ones who have all the right answers. Run from that. I'm serious. Run from that, because no one has all the right answers. And the more I study this, one time I used to think I had a lot of the answers, and it's like, oh, I had this all figured out. And the more I study, the more I realize I don't. Right? And the more I realize I'm learning new things every single day as I study this, and things that I thought were true several years ago, a couple of years ago, maybe even a year ago, right? I'm like, okay, I don't know if that's true anymore, because the more I study, the more I look at it, the more I see and how the Bible develops, that, man, where I'm always learning. There's always something I can learn and pick up on. And so he says in verse 3, but the person who loves God is the one whom God recognizes. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't show love to others, if you don't love God, right? If you love God, you're going to love others, then that's who God recognizes. Verse 4, so what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Well, we all know that an idol is not really a god, and that there is only one God. So he's like, that's common knowledge. We know that. There may be so-called gods both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords, but for us, there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created, and by all whom live. And for whom all we live. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. Through him all things were created, and through him we live. However, not all believers know this, right? So there's this idea. A lot of these people grew up in idol worship, and so he says some are accustomed to thinking of idols as being real. So when they eat food that has been offered to idols, they think of it as the worship of real gods, and their weak consciences are violated. And so he's like, they don't understand this yet, right? They're still weak Christians, weak in the faith, and so he says it's true that we can't win God's approval by what we eat, right? There isn't, all right? God's not going to judge us based on what we eat. He says we don't lose anything if we don't eat it, and we don't gain anything if we do. He says, but you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble, right? For if others see you with your superior knowledge, in quotes, eating in the temple of an idol, won't they be encouraged to violate their conscience by eating food that has been offered to an idol? So, because of your superior knowledge, a weak believer for whom Christ died will be destroyed. And when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something they believe is wrong, you are sinning against Christ. Read this a couple times. This is really important, right? Just because we have the freedom to do something doesn't mean we should do it, right? And a lot of people, I've heard this, especially in America. This is more of an American thing. Like, no one's going to tell me what I'm free, because freedom is a big thing in America, and it bleeds over into people's Christianity. Sometimes it's like, I have my rights, and I'm going to do what I want. No one's going to tell me what to do. Well, that's Paul saying that's not what a Christian attitude looks like, right? If what you would know is right, right, he knows this. Like, he knows, we know that it doesn't matter if food's been offered to an idol or not, if you eat it or not, right? And so one of the things about this too is they would be eating in the temple of an idol, because this was a common thing. We're going to look at this in the notes. And so he's saying this could cause someone to stumble. And so your arrogance, again, this goes back to the arrogance he's been talking about, your superior knowledge that you have. He's saying, look, your superior knowledge could cause someone to stumble. Yes, we know that this isn't a sin. There's nothing sinful about it. But if you cause someone to stumble, or then encourage someone who thinks it is wrong to go ahead and do something that they think's not right, then that's actually sinning. If someone's doing something they believe is wrong, that you cause them to sin, right? And not only do you cause them to sin, you're sinning against Christ by doing the same thing. And so we've got to be very careful with this in our freedoms and in our knowledge, not to cause other people to stumble, and maybe work to a point where they understand. But until you get to that point, you shouldn't force something on someone, or just dismiss someone because they don't understand it yet. And that's kind of what he's saying here. Verse 13. So if what I eat causes a believer to sin, I will not eat meat again as long as I live, for I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. He's saying, look, this is so important. This is so important. I know it's not wrong, but if it causes another believer to sin, then I'm not going to do it. And so that's what he's saying. He's like, I'm going to give up my freedoms in order to protect my brother or sister in Christ, because that's how much I care for them. It's putting them first. It's loving them. It's showing that love that he's talking about. It's putting them first, not trying to be arrogant in your knowledge and understanding here. And so going back to the notes here, all right, now regarding, when Paul says now regarding this, this indicates that every time we see this, is Paul is answering a question that had been given to him. So he's switching up a little bit. Every time he does, he's switching subjects, going to another question that was asked. And so he's going to the next question, which was about food sacrificed to idols. And so by custom in Corinth, right, the Corinthians commonly dine in pagan temples. It was not uncommon to do that. It would be the center for civic activities. It would be like going and there's a community event that it would take place a lot of times in these temples, and so Christians would go to these and they would eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, right? And Paul tells them, like, there's nothing wrong with this. So the Corinthians wanted to know, is it permissible to eat food sacrificed to idols as they reclined at these banquets, right, in a pagan temple, or feasted in a household that had received such things? And so Paul offers kind of two, like we've seen, two guiding principles here. First is knowledge, right? The Christian freedom that we have, and this knowledge by itself makes a person arrogant. And I've seen this, right? There's a lot of people I have seen who are their knowledge is outstanding. They have a lot of knowledge, but they don't live it. Like, they know these things, but they don't live these things. And so it's love that builds up believers. And so you can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you're not loving, if you don't apply all this knowledge that you have, then it's useless. It's no good. And so we have to, love's the most important thing here, not the knowledge. It's showing love to others. And so the second thing he says, it is not by knowledge that we are approved by God. The devil knows all kinds of things. The demons know all kinds of things, right? We can have all the knowledge in the world, but by our love is how we show God that we know him. And our love towards others is that. And so the knowledge, right, that's the knowledge that counts the most, right? And the showing people love, that's the most important thing. So what he's saying here is that no believer should allow his relatively unimportant knowledge to become a cause of arrogance. And this is one of the overlying themes of Corinthians that we have here, is that they're arrogant. They're puffed up with their knowledge. They think they know all these things. And so in their arrogance, they're sinning. They're doing a lot of things they shouldn't be doing. They're not being loving. And that's one of the things that we go. So Paul answers and says, technically they have the right to eat food sacrificed to idols, right? That may surprise some people. But Paul's saying, look, God doesn't judge us based on what we eat. It's like, the what you eat and what you don't eat is not going to get you to heaven or hell, right? It's not a sin based on that. Now, gluttony, all that kind of stuff. We're not talking about that. But the logic here is sound, right? Idols are not real. We know they're not. They're not real gods. They don't exist. There's only one God, and so it's what the food is sacrificed to doesn't really matter. But his advice on the matter doesn't stop there. He switches a little bit and says, "Hey, your Christian freedom should never be flaunted or wielded carelessly. Carelessly, right? Yes, it may be okay for you to do this, but it could hinder or cause another believer to stumble, and that's where we've got to be careful." They needed to be mindful that some in their fellowship, right, being so used to idolatry and having as yet a weak conscience, right, when they're especially younger Christians, younger people who had just converted, right, they could be harmed by seeing a Christian partaking food associated with idols. And so in a language reminiscent of Jesus, Paul says that the strong are not to be a stumbling block to the weak. And so, and not weak as in like, oh, well, you're just, you're a weak person. They don't have the knowledge yet. They don't have the understanding yet. They're still babes in Christ. And so we need to walk them along. And so when misused, the right of the strong can destroy a weaker person's allegiance to Christ. And so one of the examples I'll use in this one is, and this is something that applies personally for me, is alcohol, right? There are some Christians who believe that it is wrong to drink alcohol at all. I don't believe that, right? I think if you study that, we see that personally, if you study this and we've talked about this, Jesus drank wine that had alcohol in it, all that kind of stuff. Now, if I'm around someone who I know, and obviously I'm not getting drunk or anything like that, but if if I'm around someone, right, who I know is bothered by drinking, then I'm not going to drink around them. Right now, is there anything wrong? Am I sinning if I have an alcoholic drink? No, right? The sin is in drunkenness, but if it causes that other person around me to have issues or cause them to in their understanding or their way they understand it to have problems with that or maybe stumble, then I'm not going to be a hindrance to that, right? And so that's one example of you. There's a ton of examples I think we could use for this. That's just one that I think of. One of the things that we talk about. One of the other ones could be like, one of the things we were talking about today in one of our life groups. Is like the holidays. There's some people who don't practice particular holidays for whatever reason. Now, am I going to force my belief on them around that? No, I'm not. Now, and I may have a knowledge of, hey, I don't think there's anything wrong with this particular holiday, or and it's okay to celebrate this holiday. But if I'm around someone who's doing it, I'm not going to try to force my celebration of that holiday on them. And that's what Paul's saying. It's like, look, there are things we know that like what you do, doing these things isn't sinful. It's not a sin, right? It's not going to sin. Like your salvation is not based around it, and so don't die on the heel for this, right? Especially especially with someone who's maybe a weaker Christian in the sense that they're a younger Christian or may not have as strong of faith. You do your best to help them out. And so if we see that a weaker person, right, saw a knowledgeable believer, like he says here, dining at the idol's temple, he might attach a religious significance to that. And so he's like, oh, well, that person may be worshiping, they're worshiping these gods, these false idols, and then become confused, right? They'll be confused around their allegiance. Are they really allegiant to Christ? I thought we weren't, And so they may see that as them worshiping that idol when they're really not. They're just eating food, but it can confuse a younger Christian or a more immature Christian in the faith. And so that's why we have to be careful. And so what Paul is saying here is self-limitation by more mature believers safeguards the Christian's allegiance of new believers. And so it helps protect the youngers. And so it's our responsibility as the more mature believers to do the right thing, to have self-limitations on things that we know are okay, right? We're like, oh, there's no sin in this, but a younger Christian may not know that or may not understand that yet. And so we have to be careful with that, and we have to be the more mature ones, not be arrogant and puffed up like there's nothing wrong with this, you're not going to tell me what to do. That's not the right Christian attitude to have. And so that's what Paul is calling to them, do this. And so, this especially applied in this overtly pagan environment that we saw in Corinth. And so I think there's a lot of areas that we can apply this in Christianity. Now, I have seen people try to take this too far. Like, people who are just really immature in the faith, It's like, well, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in this, you can't do this. That's different, right? If someone's being that immature in something, then I think there's ways to handle that. But if we know that someone really struggles with something, then as the more mature believer, we need to be the more mature person and step up and say, okay, I see you struggle with it. I'm not going to, at least I'm not going to do that around you, at least, right? And so those are the things that I think that we're called to in this. It's just like a lot of this is just really common sense. It's common, like showing love to people, right? If someone struggles with something, or they don't have an understanding of something, we have to, as Christians, as the more mature Christians, we have to be patient with them. We have to to walk it through with them, and maybe eventually we get to the point that they understand. Oh, okay, I see this now. I understand now. Maybe they don't, but even if they don't, we still have to be the ones who say, as the more mature, it's like, hey, okay, I'm going to let it be. Right? I'm not going to force the issue, because it's not worth forcing. If like Paul ends this with, right? If me forcing the issue causes one to stumble, then what kind of Christian are you? And he says, so if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live. That, he's saying that that's how important this is. For I don't want to cause another believer to stumble, and that this needs to be our attitude, right? If something we're doing could cause another believer to stumble, then we have to be very careful in that and make sure that we're not a stumbling block to someone, even on accident. Well, I mean, again, now if we don't know, we don't know, but we have to be careful and just be aware, like, not get so arrogant, not get so caught up in ourselves that we just stick with I know this is right, I know there's nothing wrong with this, so I'm going to do what I want. That's not the proper attitude, and that's not the attitude we should have. As always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. Um, Paul's going to continue on in this theme of giving up his rights. Tomorrow we'll look at that. It's going to become from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, the idea of giving up his rights and his freedoms to help serve others, or to help other believers. And so we'll continue with that theme. As always, appreciate everyone for watching.